Hello, everybody. We are going to get started in about 1 minute. Just waiting for the artist to join, and we're going to start at 6:30. So come on in and enjoy.
Hey,
Hi.
how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good.
How is New Orleans?
It's good. It's hot, but you know,
Yeah.
I'm still like transitioning and adjusting to being back here because I had been gone for a little while, but I'm slowly getting there.
Yeah, good. Well, we are glad to have you here with us today, and talking with you and sharing your work. So this is a series that we do called Third Space Talks, where we just connect with artists from all over the nation, to kind of sit with them and review their work, and just have good conversations with them. So you are our third episode, and we're very happy. Um, so I always like to check in just because, we're living in unusual times. How are you feeling as far as self-care and wellness? Are you good? Are you great?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I'm pretty good. I'm in a very fortunate, privileged place right now. So I have my job and my health, and so I can't complain. I'm trying to, do the necessary things to keep one's mindset level.
Yeah.
But I did just move halfway across the country, so I'm like um, trying to adjust and transition back
Of
into
course.
uh, this life. So,
Okay, well, for those of you joining, in New Orleans or the southwest part of the country, we are Express North. We are located in Newark, New Jersey. We like to call ourselves a third space. We're an arts incubator. We're university meets community. So we do a lot of community, and academic collaborative work. Um, so that's a little bit about us. My name is Ashley Davidson. I'm the digital marketing and communications manager. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are and your artistry for those of the folks that don't know you out there?
yeah. So I'm Virginia Hanusik. I'm a photographer, now based in New Orleans. So happy to be back here. But my work primarily focuses on architecture and climate change, and a lot of my work actually is takes place in coastal environments. So looking at how these landscapes that are experiencing climate change at a rapid pace are adjusting, and what that looks like in the built environment. So a lot of my work is based in South Louisiana, but I do travel quite a bit in building like a body of work that's larger, and all encompassing from not just the Gulf Coast, but the East and West Coast as well.
Yeah. And you're from the southern part of the country. So is
I'm
that
from New
correct?
York. I'm from New
Oh, you're
York.
from New York.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So how
Yeah.
did you start, doing coastal landscape photography? How did you get into that?
I went to, my background is in architectural history and theory. So I went to a liberal arts school that, didn't sort of offer any sort of studio component to design. So I majored in urban studies, like that sort of conceptual work. So I had always been interested in architecture and urban planning, but I got into photography when I was in college, actually, and was fortunate to learn from some really profound photographers like Stephen Shore, and really develop my practice that way. So I had limited professional training as a photographer and kind of have always used that as an outlet with the professional work that I'm doing in architecture and design. So I've worked for the past 5 years at different organizations, as well as in the media, talking about design discourse and those types of practice, while also having my photography work on the side. So that is kind of like the visual way of informing the work that I'm engaged in. And a lot of that work obviously has an overlap with climate change and the environmental work that my photography focuses on, because the built environment is so heavily, it's like, I think 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions every year comes from the built environment. So there's obviously a huge connect there.
Wow. How long have you been like focusing on that topic of climate change and climate injustice?
Yeah,
it's popular now, but I know you've been doing this work for, before.
Yeah, I think it really became a solid component of my work when I moved to Louisiana originally in 2014. So I was working for an organization that did a lot of work on coastal restoration in South Louisiana. So for anyone that doesn't know, Louisiana is a state that relies heavily on its wetlands for storm protection, for, its entire ecosystem and livelihood. It has experienced a rapid rate of land loss over the past 50 years in particular. So it's lost pretty much the entire state of Rhode Island, if you want to think about it in terms of like geographic size. So it's a massive environmental crisis. And I was working with folks really on the front lines for developing plans to restore that coast and understanding, how these large issues related to climate change and justice and climate migration were playing out in real time, because prior to that, I really hadn't had any experience in that. So, it kind of just became an exploration that I was doing independently of visualizing these landscapes that, get talked about most often in the media when there's flooding or other types of disasters happening, and tying it to climate change that way, rather than what do these landscapes look like in the everyday, and how are those subtle changes visualized in the built environment. So that was kind of what started my practice originally, and it's just kind of expanded to outside of South Louisiana, but still very heavily focused here.
So were you always photographing that process when you started doing that work? Because it sounds like you were doing very kind of activism work. And did you know right away, like, oh, this needs to be documented? The fact that land beside an island is now missing.
Yeah, I think I don't really come at the work as like a documentary piece. Because obviously when you're talking about these things, there's the concept of representation and who gets to tell these stories and how those stories are being disseminated in the media. So by no means do I consider myself to be like the documentarian of South Louisiana. I'm trying to talk more about how these building practices that we've been encouraging people to do since, after World War II, basically, of developing along the coast and really capitalism pushing for people to live in these flood zones. You're seeing the impacts of that more immediately here, but it's something that's happening around the country, around the world. So I'm really trying to be able to tie what's happening here into a more national, international narrative about how we inhabit space, and being able to develop what the options may be for developing, a new sort of way of living along the coast that is more just and equitable for people.
Yeah. And you talk about it being kind of like South Louisiana fitting in naturally. You photographed in New York, California. Do you see the same kind of themes of like whatever is bolstering this build along the coast, whether it be capitalism? What are some of those things that are kind of like similar that you see along these coastal communities?
I mean, there are a lot of parallels. I think that in South Louisiana, one of the most profound differences is the connection to the oil and gas industry here and how that really dominates so much of the state's economy, but it's also created so many of the problems that the state is experiencing, where you have oil and gas pipelines cutting up the coast, which contributes to the rate of coastal land loss happening here. But it has such a strong economic grasp on how any law is passed and how they're protected here. So I think that trickles down to the questions and concepts that I try to explore in my work, which is what spaces do we value over others? Which spaces and communities are exploited and why? And I think, you see environmental injustice in coastal communities around the country, New York and with the South Bronx, no one's really calling that a coastal community, but it is, it's right on the water. So you have these spaces that are heavily industrialized with communities adjacent to them that experience high rates of pollution. And you're seeing that overlap now in terms of the current pandemic, where you're having these communities that have historically experienced this air pollution, environmental injustice, having higher rates of, fatality because of these systemic issues. So you have the climate crisis currently overlapping with this pandemic. And I think, in terms of similarities and parallels throughout the different coasts that I work in, there's the environmental injustice point, and then there's also just this seeing the history of development and really tracking what fueled people to be building in these vulnerable spaces. Because at the end of the day, it's really, if you have a market and people that see living on the coast is more valuable than not, and having the protection like the federal flood insurance program that encourages that, and basically provides a safety net for if you lose your house in a storm, like you have that backing to rebuild. But that's not also equitably distributed across the board. So this is a long-winded answer to your question, but
No,
those are kind of the things. Those are the things that I'm looking at with my work, and being able to communicate that in a way that's visually compelling and different from, I think, the traditional narrative when you're talking about climate change that focuses so much on disasters and the spectacle of that, rather than talking about these systemic issues that have led us to the situation that we're currently in.
Right. I think you definitely picked that up in the work, because you get the sense that this has been a long journey captured in this moment, and not this something that has just happened. And I know when you do written work, and some of the written work, you talk about the history of certain climates and different places on the coast, as well as like how legislation has played into that. How did you, I mean, obviously you worked in the space, but how did you research, or how do you do research on some of the written pieces you do that accompanies the visual?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my research is, this is the world that I've been in for over the past 6 years. So my professional work and being involved in really on the front lines of folks that are dealing with these issues in coastal communities and speaking with them, and having those relationships are so incredibly valuable to me, and really being able to use my work to put spotlight on these injustices and stories that may not otherwise make it into the national media because they're not getting picked up after a hurricane or after a major flood event. So, you know, the more that you dig into any project, and I think that that's just the inherent responsibility that an artist possesses, is if you're talking about people's livelihoods or stories in any way, you have to do your research and you have to be respectful and responsible in that. So, you know, I also want to understand all different sides of the story. So when you're thinking about the history of landscape photography, which I talk about a lot in my work, and how that translates to our current art industry and how art is disseminated and who commissions work and how do you perceive value. You know, that traces for me back to these original notions of American identity being tied to landscape. And, you know, the Hudson River School and these paintings that really defined American identity at the time. Who made those paintings? You know, a small group of, you know, white men that originally created these pieces to encourage people to move west and preserve certain areas over others and use prioritize spaces as recreation for a small group of people. So the whole notion of landscape photography and painting were founded on these ideals. And now I'm trying to like find ways to unpack that in my current work and find opportunities to kind of like dismantle that system that has been established since like the early 1800s. So
Yeah.
I do a lot of, I mean, this is like my world. So I'm always, you know, I'm very active on Twitter and like I find all of my climate news through that, and, you know, different think tanks and academics that are doing this in-depth research. So it's important for me to be able to stay on top of that.
Yeah. I want to get into some of the image, but I just want to talk about some of the people that live in these communities. And a lot of your work, you know, it's void of people. I'm sure that's intentional for whatever reason. But what happens to the people in these communities, and how do they, you know, ultimately get along when the land underneath them is disappearing?
Mm-hmm. You know, and that's kind of something that I haven't figured out exactly. You're right. Like, I don't include people in my work as like an artistic choice, and it's intentional. It's meant to really be, it comes from a place where I want the architecture and infrastructure to really speak for itself. And even though there aren't explicitly people in photographs, the choices and decisions that have pushed policy to create the current landscape that we're in were done by people. So I try to be like symbolic of that. But in any sort of story or project or exhibition that I have, it's important for me to be able to tie in that policy and what's happening now to help people. That's really, whether that's tied to the Green New Deal or other types of programs that assist folks in either getting assistance with resettling away from these vulnerable spaces. In the case of South Louisiana, there's a program that is not put in law yet, but it is a program that's like the most ambitious climate adaptation strategy in the country right now, called LA Safe. It's an acronym for Louisiana Adaptations for Safe Future Environments, something like that. I'm glad that my friend's not on here who wrote that piece. But anyway, it's essentially, you know, a program that would create an equitable way to move people out of these areas instead of just having, you know, this free-for-all that currently exists in a lot of places around the country, where property values are decreasing. No one wants to be buying property along the coast that consistently floods. So you're unable to sell your house. Well, what does that mean? Like, you're just going to leave someone in this vulnerable position instead of helping migrate them outwards. And then once you do, what type of house do they have? How do you hold on to that sense of community that was once there? So all of these questions. But for me, it's important to be able to tie that in instead of just kind of creating this visual. Like I said, I don't see myself as a documentarian, but rather trying to piece these stories together of how we created the situation and what opportunities there are to make it a better planning process in the future.
Yeah. In your written piece, Climate Gentrification and New American Codes, you talk about climate gentrification. What exactly does that mean?
So climate gentrification is technically a term coined by these group of researchers out of Harvard, that they were looking at communities in Miami where historically the most valuable real estate is in Miami Beach and along the water. You're now seeing, as the predictions become more and more grim for how quickly sea levels will rise, you're having developers purchase land that's farther inland. So you're actually like flipping that paradigm that used to exist on its head, where lower value is inland, higher value is on the coast. So because of that, you had communities that are much less affluent living in neighborhoods like Little Haiti. So now, as you're having people development and that value changing, you're pushing those communities out, and in some cases pushing them to live closer to the water in a more vulnerable place, rather than providing opportunities for them to also inhabit safer land. So that's kind of like the geography of how it's happening right now in Miami. But in different coastal communities, it would still, I would imagine it operating the same way, where you're having people moving farther inland and displacing those that can't afford to stay in those places anymore because of property value.
Yeah. So I want to get into some of the images. I want to talk about your aesthetic approach, how you approach your process. So I'll just select the first one we have here. If you could just tell us, where this is, an issue or a cause it might have been attached to, and just a little bit about the piece.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, some of these are, I think I gave you just kind of like a mix of locations. So this is in Coney Island. For like the past 2 years, when I was living in New York, I started working on a project that is about how the New York coastline is used, whether that's for recreation, transportation, waste, all these different things. So I photographed in Coney Island a lot, and the aesthetic choice to go black and white is really dependent on just kind of the light that I have during the day. So this is like during midday, very bright light, and seeing Coney Island kind of through this lens almost has like a historical feel to it, for me at least. So this project is very much still under development, but it's essentially a way of trying to capture the various and kind of disjointed climate policies that are going on in the city. Post Sandy, you had several neighborhoods that actually received government buyouts to get them away from the coast. I don't really know how effective buyout programs are when they're done in such a small cluster, rather than having it be like a more regional approach.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of what this project is trying to examine, where you have these communities like in South Brooklyn and in Queens and around Jamaica Bay that are super exposed to flooding and hurricanes. How the everyday experiences lived there, how there are still places of recreation, but at the same time, less than a mile away, you'll have these stretches, like in Arverne, Queens, or in Edgemere, where there are various lots that are just completely vacant because of post-Sandy buyouts and, houses that weren't built back. So when you look at it at like a more regional scale and seeing high-rise condos in Williamsburg being built on the water, but then also in Staten Island having like these massive areas with, just like I said, vacant land, you start to see kind of these differences in protection and what neighborhoods become kind of like barriers to more affluent neighborhoods. So that's what this piece is from.
Okay.
This is also at Coney Island too. So yeah, it's like trying to get it's almost like a film noir type aspect. So there's something that I try to, there's so much energy in these spaces, and I think, trying to capture it in black and white and having it slow down for a moment so you can really kind of analyze how people are interacting with the built environment there is part of the reason that I go for like the black and white approach.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay. Where are we?
Yeah, this is in California. This is like off of Route 1, about half an hour, 45 minutes north of San Francisco. So this is like a camp, recreational camp that's built literally off of a cliff there. So similar, there's a pattern here in my work. Like I don't really necessarily stray too far from these coastal spaces, but similarly here, the California coast is endlessly interesting to me because it's one of like the earliest and most profound projects in public access to the beach. In 1976, the California Coastal Commission was passed and, creating this precedent for public beach access and seeing the beach and the coast as like a public right. Obviously there's contention there, and it hasn't been a fluid program throughout its whole existence. There's obviously people that are against the notion of equal access to the coast, and especially as you have private development there restricting that access. But anyway, the California coast is so unique too, just in terms of its geography and its elevation, and understanding kind of the different risks that environment possesses with earthquakes and tsunamis and other natural events. So it's just like whenever I go to California, it's just a really exciting opportunity for me to kind of dabble in these different perspectives and get a sense of elevation with the work. Whereas in South Louisiana, where I take most of my photographs, it's very flat. So the elevation and just kind of changing the perception and depth of the photographs is not something that I get to experiment with often here. So when I'm in different environments, I try to do that there.
Yeah, and the black and white was also a choice just because of the time of day, similar to Coney Island.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I honestly, like, in full transparency, I don't go into, I kind of just end up vibing it out. And I know that sounds very unprofessional of me, but, I kind of see the different colors and tones that I'm working with and the time of day, and the aesthetic choice to go black and white is, mostly how I see it fitting into the larger portfolio of the work. So, but yes, that was also midday, so it's very bright.
All right, we're going to go to one that's color, another beautiful one, which is like stunning.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah, it's, I don't feel like I have to work that hard to get these beautiful images in Louisiana because the landscape, in my opinion, is so inherently beautiful. But this is I think this was from 2017. But part of my larger project on the architecture and infrastructure of South Louisiana, so trying to really develop a holistic sort of portfolio that got at the different building styles and how these spaces that are considered, traditional church, retail, commercial, residential, all of these different spaces, like the diversity and form of them. So I take a lot of my work here on my friend's kayak. So I get to, this is only accessible via kayak. This is on the
At one
Bourne
point,
River.
this was land, I'm assuming, for them to have built this here, or no?
So it's on land. It's on like a small strip of land, but there's no road there. So you have to get to it via kayak. Yeah. And those are like some of my favorite shoots when I'm able to get on the water and play with reflection in that way.
Okay. This is one, speaking of reflection, we've been using this to promote the event. It immediately jumps out at you. How did you shoot this?
On a kayak as well. This was like in the middle of the day, extremely hot day in June. But yeah, I think, being from the East Coast and not really having any sort of experience with houseboats before, although I have found them in New York since returning there. They are there in Jamaica Bay. If you look hard enough, you can find a houseboat anywhere. I've been trying. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested in, the architecture of these spaces and really kind of getting at how these structures have adapted over time to different, changes in the environment. So rather than seeing these images of disasters or, journalists kind of helicoptering in and making judgments about how crazy it is that people live in flood zones, I'm more interested in looking at how these typologies have adapted over time to living on the water, and what kind of insights we can gain from that history, and really kind of, honoring and respecting those traditions of a space.
I love that. Okay.
Yeah, so this one is from Lake Verret, which is in Assumption Parish. It's about like 2 hours west of New Orleans. But this is one of my favorite pictures. It's and this is like a little bit about my engagement and really making it a prominent aspect of my work is being able to engage and talk with folks that live in these spaces. You can imagine that on a houseboat, it's like not really possible to just kind of walk up to someone's house and like knock on their door. So I use, my social media has been a really great way for me to get to meet people that live in these places. And I actually posted this, which was like the feature photo from my last show that I had in New Orleans. The owners of this camp actually reached out to me and they're like, that's my camp. And I got to talk with them and unlearn, the full history of their family and building it and experiences that they've had with flooding and, just getting like those really wonderful anecdotes that are so important and make the work that I'm doing that much richer, and being able to kind of get their insight and feedback on the projects that I've been doing. So this was built in the 70s. It's part of the Keys family owns it. So shout out to Jason. But yeah, I mean, this is like just another example of playing with black and white and really deciding what sort of picture tone wise, whether or not I'm going to go black and white or in color. In this situation, it just felt very dramatic by the way that the sunset was hitting the house directly, and then having the Spanish moss in the background as kind of like dripping down.
But, yeah. And speaking of like respecting the space of the people who still live in these communities and being adaptive, how have they adjusted economically? Like what are the economic opportunities? How do they make a living? How do they, say we can stay in these communities? We've been here for decades. Have you talked to some of the residents at all about any of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what's needed so badly in terms of adjusting the physical landscape of Louisiana means adjusting the entire economy of the region because so much of it is based on oil and gas. A lot of it is also the seafood industry. Louisiana exports an insane amount of, like, most of the nation's seafood comes from here, or at least most of their shrimp. So that's a huge component of the economy here. So those physical changes have a direct effect on how people make their money and those types of industries. So when you're thinking about migration strategies and moving people out of the way or providing, whatever the safest option is, whether that's staying and raising your house, whether that's, literally moving to a different community that's higher elevation, you have to be thinking about what the economic impact of that is as well. And in a lot of cases, not just in South Louisiana, but in other environments that are experiencing these physical changes, what sorts of opportunities you have to like consider this to be a time to rethink the economy as well.
Yep.
So a lot of my work and being able to connect and understand what sort of policy is being passed or what opportunities there are to create more diverse economies, especially in New Orleans and the surrounding region, that make it more resilient, rather than just having it rely on two, tiers, the petrochemical industry and seafood, and in New Orleans tourism. So yeah, I mean, that's a major component of my work and being able to tie kind of that policy into the visual narrative.
Yeah. And you've been doing the work since about 2014, you said. How has like public perception changed around these topics as well as the political discourse in your opinion, if at all?
I think that it's becoming more attention is being paid to it. I don't know if things are changing at the rate that they need to. Well, I know that they're not changing at the rate that they need to, but I think more attention is being paid and more people are getting opportunities to really have a voice at the table. Organizations that are really advocating for more diverse voices in planning and climate justice, and knowing that whatever we design for the future can't be what has been in the past. So, I kind of just try to tune out stories that I see in the media that are very like climate doomsday oriented or have visuals that are just completely like from storm damage or flooding. Because of course those are stories that need to be told, but in the larger, I'm more interested in kind of motivating people and being able to familiarize themselves in these landscapes rather than creating this environment where it's almost like a doomsday apocalypse and that causes people to dissociate.
Right. Where do you like see the work going next, or what is the impact that you hope to continue to have with this work? What would be a success for you, especially in Southern Louisiana where you live, or New York where you're from? Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm working hard to collaborate with folks more on projects rather than having it be just strictly photography based. So My next project that I'm currently building out is about the inequality of disaster relief on the Gulf Coast, and really kind of tracing the history of flood insurance and who benefits from that, and kind of tracing, you see these stories, especially coming out in the past year post Harvey and other hurricanes that have hit the Gulf Coast, how these disasters exacerbate inequality that's already existed. So I'm working with several partners right now to kind of apply for grants together and figure out a way that those non-traditionally fun topics like flood insurance can be communicated in a way that brings larger audiences in, and breaks it down in a way that is compelling and accessible to people.
Yeah. And is that up and coming work going to be based in Southern Louisiana, or just broadly some of the places you've been in coastal communities?
I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit.
Oh no. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you better.
Okay. Is that work, if you can say, going to be based in Southern Louisiana or just coastal communities in general?
This project is going to be around the Gulf Coast primarily as like a geographic location, but it's also something that transcends this region, and you can see, in economic data and kind of tracking disaster relief around the country, there's inherently communities that benefit from the way that policy is currently set up to helping people rebuild their homes, versus others. So that's something that I definitely would be interested in exploring in other places too.
Yeah. I think like as a country, we're definitely starting to have an awareness shift about climate injustice and climate change. Where do you see your work fitting in, in this overall dialogue or narrative, 10 years from now or 15 years from now? Because I think this is the moment where that shift is kind of happening, and your work is certainly, helping to do that. It's been, you've been doing shows and published and lectures. So how do you see the legacy of this work fitting in?
Um, I really try to make these topics of climate change something that people are not intimidated to become engaged in or involved in. Some of the writers and people that I respect the most in this space are folks that don't do any sort of like environmental shaming, and really kind of meet people where they are, and don't ask that you don't need to change your entire. Climate change is not something that can be solved on an individual basis. It's not going to be solved whether you recycle your plastic or not. I mean, you should, but it's much more something that needs to be changed from a systems level. So using art and, in my case, photography, to kind of engage and inform people in that, and use it as a access point to getting more involved in these issues and in climate activism, that's what I hope to accomplish.
I definitely think you're doing that. For me personally, it's been an access point.
Yay.
I just think the images are beautiful, and once you look at them, you have to read about them. You have to like unpack them. The point about like people not being in it in the built spaces, because at some point this was made for people, so where are the people?
Yeah.
Was one of the things that pulled me in right away. Like, there's a what happened here, in a very beautiful, mysterious way.
Yeah. And I also just want to add too, because I don't think I mentioned this, but in terms of storytelling about these places that, kind of victimizes people that reside here, and kind of creates these like generalizations or blanket statements that this place is never going to be saved. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm more trying to look at and like honor these places with respect, and be able to learn from what they have already been experiencing.
Yeah. which makes a lot of sense because, people were there and you want to honor that in a way that feels really authentic and purposeful.
Yeah.
So, do we have any questions for Miss Virginia? Let me see. I think we're good. I'm just scrolling to make sure I didn't miss any. Okay. Well, we're going to wrap up. This has been a great conversation. I want to thank you again for jumping on live with us. Much continued success, and thank you for your artwork.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Stay safe. Stay well.
All right. Thanks, Ashley.